Charles Beaumont had conquered boardrooms, charmed socialites, and signed billion-dollar deals without breaking a sweat. But one stern-eyed doctor with a stethoscope reduced him to the most ridiculous man alive. Charles Beaumont strode through the antiseptic corridors of Providence General Hospital, with the confident gait of a man who had never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved with money, charm, or a combination of both. At 34, he had built an empire from nothing more than ambition and an uncanny ability to read people's desires before they knew what they wanted themselves. His tailored Italian suit looked absurdly out of place among the scrubs and wheelchairs. But Charles had never been one to blend into his surroundings. He was here for Mrs. Whitmore, his secretary of 15 years, who had suffered what the doctors diplomatically called a mild cardiac event, but what Charles knew was a heart attack brought on by his relentless schedule and impossible demands. The guilt had been gnawing at him for 3 days, ever since he'd found her collapsed over his appointment calendar, clutching her chest and apologizing for the inconvenience. Mrs. Whitmore occupied a private room on the cardiac floor, courtesy of Charles's immediate donation to the hospital's new wing fund. She looked smaller in the hospital bed, her usually perfect silver hair mussed against the pillow. But her eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had made her indispensable to his business operations. "Mr. Beaumont," she said as he entered, her voice carrying the same mixture of fondness and exasperation that had characterized their working relationship since he was 19, and foolish enough to think he could run a company without help. "You didn't need to come. I told you I'm perfectly fine." "Define perfectly fine," Charles replied, settling into the visitor's chair with the awkward care of someone unaccustomed to hospital environments. "Because from where I'm sitting, perfectly fine doesn't usually involve cardiac monitors and IV drips." Mrs. Whitmore waved a dismissive hand, the gesture made less authoritative by the various tubes attached to her arm. It was barely a flutter. "These doctors are making a mountain out of a molehill. I'll be back at my desk by Monday." "You'll be back at your desk when your doctor says you can be back at your desk," Charles corrected, his tone carrying the kind of absolute authority that had made him millions, and not a moment before. It was at precisely that moment, as Charles was delivering his most commanding executive directive, that Dr. Emma Hayes walked into the room and made him forget every word he had ever learned. She wasn't conventionally beautiful in the way of the socialites and models, who usually decorated Charles's arm at charity galas. Dr. Hayes possessed something more dangerous than mere beauty. She had presence. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail that suggested she had more important things to worry about than primping, and her white coat bore the comfortable wrinkles of someone who had been working for hours without pause. But it was her eyes that stopped Charles's breath. Intelligent, assessing, completely unimpressed by his expensive suit or his obvious wealth. "Mrs. Whitmore," Dr. Hayes said, consulting the tablet in her hands with professional efficiency. "How are you feeling this afternoon? Any chest pain? Shortness of breath?" Charles opened his mouth to introduce himself, to deploy the charm that had never failed to win over even the most resistant personalities. But no sound emerged. His vocal cords had apparently declared an immediate strike in the face of Dr. Hayes's presence. "I'm feeling wonderful, dear," Mrs. Whitmore replied, shooting Charles a knowing look that suggested she was enjoying his sudden speechlessness far more than she should, just eager to get back to taking care of this one. "He's utterly helpless without me." Dr. Hayes glanced at Charles for the first time, and he felt his heart perform some sort of acrobatic maneuver that definitely wasn't medically advisable. Her gaze was clinical, professional, and completely devastating to his usual composure. "Mr. she prompted, clearly expecting an introduction. "Beaumont," Charles managed, his voice emerging as something between a croak and a whisper. "Charles Beaumont." "Mr. Beaumont," Dr. Hayes repeated, and something about the way she said his name made his knees weak. "You're Mrs. Whitmore's employer?" Charles nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady if he attempted actual words. This was ridiculous. He was a grown man, a successful businessman who negotiated with heads of state and corporate titans. He should not be reduced to nodding like a schoolboy by one doctor with pretty eyes and a stethoscope. "Well, Mr. Beaumont," Dr. Hayes continued, returning her attention to Mrs. Whitmore's chart. I'm pleased to report that Mrs. Whitmore's cardiac enzyme levels have stabilized. Her EKG shows normal rhythm, and her blood pressure has returned to acceptable parameters. Charles had no idea what any of that meant, but the way Dr. Hayes explained it, with such competent authority, made him want to understand everything about cardiac care immediately. Perhaps he should take some medical courses. Perhaps he should donate to the hospital's cardiology research program. Perhaps he should buy the entire hospital just to have an excuse to spend more time listening to Dr. Hayes discuss enzyme levels. When can she return to work? He asked, proud that he had managed to form a complete sentence. Dr. Hayes looked at him with the kind of patience typically reserved for particularly slow children. Mrs. Whitmore suffered a myocardial infarction, Mr. Beaumont. Her heart muscle was damaged. She'll need at least 6 weeks of rest and cardiac rehabilitation before she can resume normal activities. 6 weeks? Charles felt panic rising in his chest. Not because he couldn't function without Mrs. Whitmore, though he certainly couldn't, but because 6 weeks meant no reason to visit the hospital. No reason to see Dr. Hayes again. Minimum, Dr. Hayes confirmed, making a note on her tablet. And that assumes she follows all medical recommendations and attends every rehabilitation session. Of course she'll follow your recommendations, Charles said, his voice taking on a desperate edge. Whatever you need. Any treatment, any equipment, any... Mr. Beaumont, Dr. Hayes interrupted gently. Mrs. Whitmore's recovery depends on rest and proper medical care, not on expensive interventions. The best thing you can do is give her time to heal. Time to heal. Charles watched Dr. Hayes complete her examination, noted the gentle way she adjusted Mrs. Whitmore's blankets, observed the professional competence with which she handled every aspect of her patient's care. This woman was extraordinary, not just beautiful, but brilliant, dedicated, completely absorbed in work that actually mattered. He was in serious trouble. I'll check on you again this evening, Mrs. Whitmore, Dr. Hayes said, moving toward the door with the brisk efficiency of someone with dozen more patients to see. Dr. Hayes? Charles called out, surprising himself with his boldness. Thank you. For everything you're doing for her. Dr. Hayes paused at the doorway, turning back with an expression that was professionally polite, but not entirely dismissive. It's my job, Mr. Beaumont, but you're welcome. After she left, Charles sat in the hospital chair staring at the empty doorway like a man who had just witnessed a miracle. His hands were trembling slightly, his heart was racing, and he felt dizzy in a way that had nothing to do with the hospital's fluorescent lighting. Oh, my, Mrs. Whitmore said, her voice filled with barely suppressed laughter. This is going to be interesting. What's going to be interesting? Charles asked, though he suspected he knew exactly what his secretary meant. You, Mr. Beaumont, Mrs. Whitmore replied, with the satisfied smile of someone who had just discovered the most entertaining secret in the world. You're completely smitten with my doctor. Charles opened his mouth to deny it, to assert that his interest in Dr. Hayes was purely professional concern for Mrs. Whitmore's medical care. But the words wouldn't come, partly because lying had never been one of his talents, and partly because Mrs. Whitmore was absolutely, terrifyingly correct. He was smitten. Completely, ridiculously, hopelessly smitten with a woman who probably thought of him as nothing more than another worried relative cluttering up her hospital rounds. What was a billionaire to do when his heart flatlines at first sight? Charles Beaumont had built his fortune on the principle that every problem had a solution, and every solution simply required the right combination of resources, strategy, and relentless determination. The problem of Dr. Emma Hayes, specifically, the problem of how to see her again without appearing to be a complete lunatic, seemed to require all three in unprecedented quantities. He spent the first night after meeting, Dr. Hayes lying awake in his penthouse apartment, staring at the ceiling and formulating increasingly elaborate plans. He could donate to the hospital's cardiac wing. He could endow a research grant in Mrs. Whitmore's name. He could fund an entire new medical school if that's what it took to create legitimate reasons to interact with the woman who had somehow managed to short-circuit his entire nervous system with nothing more than professional competence and a pair of intelligent eyes. By morning, Charles had settled on a more direct approach. He would simply visit Mrs. Whitmore every day, frequently, with great concern for her medical progress that would naturally require detailed discussions with her attending physician. It was a foolproof plan. What could possibly go wrong? Charles arrived at the hospital the next afternoon, armed with an enormous bouquet of flowers, a selection of Mrs. Whitmore's favorite magazines, and what he had convinced himself was a perfectly reasonable excuse for extended hospital visits. He found Mrs. Whitmore looking significantly better, sitting up in bed and working on a crossword puzzle with the determined concentration of someone accustomed to solving complex problems. "Mr. Beaumont," she greeted him with obvious amusement. "Back so soon? I told you yesterday that I was fine." "I was in the neighborhood," Charles lied smoothly, settling into the visitor's chair with the elaborate casualness of someone who had definitely not rearranged his entire schedule around hospital visiting hours. "How are you feeling? Any changes in your condition? New symptoms? Concerns that might require immediate consultation with your medical team?" Mrs. Whitmore raised an eyebrow. In 15 years of working together, she had developed an uncanny ability to see straight through Charles's various schemes and manipulations. "My medical team? Dr. Hayes," Charles clarified, trying to sound nonchalant and failing spectacularly. "Is she making her rounds today? I had some questions about your treatment plan." "Questions about my treatment plan," Mrs. Whitmore repeated slowly, as if she were examining each word for hidden meanings. "What sort of questions?" Charles had prepared for this. He had spent the morning researching cardiac care on the internet, memorizing medical terminology, and crafting what he believed were sophisticated inquiries about Mrs. Whitmore's condition. "Well," he began, consulting the notes he had written on his phone, "I was wondering about the optimization of your beta-blocker protocol in relation to your ACE inhibitor therapy, and whether your cardiac enzyme levels indicate the need for additional antiplatelet intervention." Mrs. Whitmore stared at him for several long seconds. Then she began to laugh, not the polite chuckle she usually employed for Charles's more ridiculous business ideas, but a full-bodied, delighted laugh that made her cardiac monitor beep with increased activity. "Charles Beaumont," she said when she had recovered enough to speak, "did you spend your morning memorizing a cardiology textbook?" "I may have done some research," Charles admitted, his cheeks warming with embarrassment. "I wanted to be informed about your medical care, and this sudden interest in cardiac pharmacology has nothing to do with the fact that Dr. Hayes is brilliant and beautiful and completely unimpressed by your usual charm." Before Charles could formulate a response that maintained even a pretense of dignity, Dr. Hayes appeared in the doorway as if summoned by their conversation. She looked even more stunning than Charles remembered, if such a thing were possible. Her hair was slightly mussed from what had obviously been a long day, and she moved with the efficient grace of someone accustomed to being in constant motion. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Whitmore," she said, consulting her ever-present tablet. "How are you feeling today?" "Much better, thank you," Mrs. Whitmore replied, shooting Charles a look that promised extensive teasing later. "Mr. Beaumont here was just asking me some very technical questions about my treatment." Dr. Hayes glanced at Charles with mild surprise. "Oh? What kind of questions?" This was his moment. Charles straightened his shoulders, consulted his phone, and launched into what he had convinced himself was an impressively sophisticated medical inquiry. "I was wondering about the optimization of her beta-blocker protocol in relation to her ACE inhibitor therapy," he said, proud of how naturally the terms rolled off his tongue, "and whether her cardiac enzyme levels indicate the need for additional antiplatelet intervention." Dr. Hayes blinked. Once. Twice. Then she tilted her head slightly, studying Charles with the kind of intense focus that made his heart perform another one of its unauthorized acrobatic routines. "That's very specific," she said carefully. "Are you in the medical field, Mr. Beaumont?" "Oh, no," Charles replied quickly. "I'm in business, but I believe in being thoroughly informed about matters that affect people I care about." "I see." Dr. Hayes made a note on her tablet, and Charles wondered frantically whether she was recording his medical curiosity or his obvious attempt to impress her with borrowed expertise. "Well, to answer your question, Mrs. Whitmore's current medication regimen is appropriate for her condition. Her enzyme levels have normalized, and additional antiplatelet therapy isn't indicated at this time." Charles nodded as if this information was both expected and deeply satisfying. "Excellent. And what about her... He glanced at his phone, searching for another impressive medical term. Her ejection fraction optimization? This time, Dr. Hayes actually smiled. Just a slight curve of her lips. But enough to make Charles feel like he had just won the lottery. Her ejection fraction is within normal limits, Dr. Hayes said, her tone suggesting she was enjoying this conversation more than she probably should. You've certainly done your research, Mr. Beaumont. I'm a very thorough person, Charles replied, which was true, though he had never applied his thoroughness to cardiac care before meeting Dr. Hayes. Over the next week, Charles's hospital visits became increasingly elaborate productions. He arrived with different flowers each day, claiming he wanted to ensure Mrs. Whitmore's room had optimal therapeutic ambiance. He brought books about cardiac health, insisting that patient education was crucial for recovery. He even had his assistant research the hospital's cafeteria menu so he could suggest nutritional modifications for Mrs. Whitmore's cardiac diet. But his masterpiece of medical dedication came on Thursday, when he appeared at the hospital wearing a clipboard and what he had convinced himself was a very official-looking badge. Good afternoon, he announced to the nurse's station. Charles Beaumont, hospital efficiency consultant. I'm here to evaluate the cardiac care protocols for optimization opportunities. The charge nurse, a woman named Betty who had been working in cardiac care since before Charles was born, looked at him with the kind of patient skepticism typically reserved for very small children and very confused adults. Hospital efficiency consultant? She repeated. That's right, Charles confirmed, consulting his clipboard with professional seriousness. I specialize in cardiac care workflow optimization. I'll need to observe the daily routines, speak with the medical staff, perhaps shadow some of the doctors during their rounds. Betty glanced at his expensive suit, his obviously fake badge, and his clipboard filled with what appeared to be grocery lists and stock quotes. And the hospital administration approved this consultation? She asked. Charles felt sweat beginning to form on his forehead. He had not thought this plan through entirely. Well, not exactly approved. More like enthusiastically anticipated. Uh-huh. Betty picked up her phone. Let me just call security. That won't be necessary, Dr. Hayes's voice interrupted from behind Charles, and he spun around to find her watching the entire scene with obvious amusement. Mr. Beaumont is here to visit Mrs. Whitmore, aren't you, Mr. Beaumont? Charles nodded frantically, his fake badge suddenly feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Though I am curious, Dr. Hayes continued, moving closer with the predatory grace of someone who had clearly figured out exactly what was happening, about your qualifications as a hospital efficiency consultant. Well, Charles began, his voice cracking slightly, I have extensive experience in operational optimization, and I care deeply about cardiac care efficiency. I'm sure you do, Dr. Hayes said, her tone suggesting she was trying very hard not to laugh. Perhaps we should discuss your consultation in private. My office? Charles followed Dr. Hayes down the corridor like a man walking to his execution, his fake badge feeling heavier with each step. Her office was small, cluttered with medical journals and coffee cups, and decorated with what appeared to be children's drawings, probably thank you notes from young patients. Sit, Dr. Hayes commanded, settling behind her desk with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Charles sat. Now, she continued, leaning forward with her hands folded, would you like to explain what you're really doing here? And please don't tell me you're a hospital consultant, because I called administration, and they've never heard of you. Charles opened his mouth to deploy another elaborate excuse, but something in Dr. Hayes's expression, not angry exactly, but definitely expecting honesty, made him abandon all pretense. I wanted to see you again, he said simply. Dr. Hayes blinked. I'm sorry? I wanted to see you again, Charles repeated, his voice gaining strength as he committed to the truth. And I couldn't think of any reasonable way to do that except by visiting Mrs. Whitmore. But then I started worrying that you might think I was just a concerned employer, so I tried to seem more medically knowledgeable. And then I thought maybe if I seemed like a professional consultant, I could spend more time in the hospital, and we might run into each other more often. Dr. Hayes stared at him for several long moments, Then, to Charles's amazement, she began to laugh. Not the polite professional chuckle he had expected, but a genuine, delighted laugh that made her entire face light up. "Mr. Beaumont," she said when she had recovered enough to speak, "that is either the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard, or the most elaborate pickup attempt in medical history." "Probably both," Charles admitted, his cheeks burning with embarrassment. "Definitely both," Dr. Hayes agreed. Then, to his complete shock, she smiled. A real smile, warm and amused and maybe just a little bit impressed. "But I have to ask, how long were you planning to keep this up? The fake medical expertise, the made-up consulting business. How long could a man fake hypochondria without getting caught?" Charles looked at Dr. Hayes's smiling face, at the genuine amusement in her intelligent eyes, and realized that getting caught might just be the best thing that had ever happened to him. But first, he had to figure out how to convince her that his interest went far deeper than elaborate hospital hijinks, and that was going to require an even more ridiculous plan. After being thoroughly exposed as a fake hospital consultant, Charles Beaumont faced what was undoubtedly the greatest strategic challenge of his business career: how to recover from complete humiliation while simultaneously convincing Dr. Emma Hayes that he was worth her time and attention. Most men would have retreated, licked their wounds, and perhaps tried a more conventional approach to courtship. Charles Beaumont was not most men. The next morning, he arrived at the hospital looking pale, slightly unsteady, and wearing what he had convinced himself was the perfect expression of barely contained medical distress. He had spent the previous evening researching symptoms that would be concerning enough to require medical attention, but not so serious as to actually alarm anyone. What he had settled on was a masterpiece of calculated ambiguity, dizziness, fatigue, and what he described to the emergency room triage nurse as a general feeling of cardiac irregularity. "I'm sorry," the nurse said, looking up from her computer screen with the kind of professional patience that suggested she had heard every possible combination of vague symptoms in her career. "Did you say cardiac irregularity?" "That's right," Charles confirmed, placing one hand dramatically over his heart. "It's been going on for days. Fluttering, palpitations. Sometimes it feels like my heart just stops." This was not entirely untrue. His heart had been behaving very strangely since meeting Dr. Hayes, though Charles was reasonably certain that the cause was romantic rather than medical. "And you've never experienced these symptoms before?" the nurse asked, clearly trying to determine whether Charles was having a genuine medical emergency or was simply one of the many hypochondriacs who populated emergency rooms across the country. "Never," Charles lied smoothly. "I'm normally in perfect health. I run marathons. I climb mountains. I've never had so much as a headache." This was also not entirely true, but Charles figured that a little creative license was acceptable when pursuing the love of one's life. The nurse sighed, made several notes on her computer, and handed Charles a clipboard full of forms. "Fill these out completely. Someone will be with you shortly." Charles completed the paperwork with the same attention to detail he brought to billion-dollar contracts, carefully crafting a medical history that was mysterious enough to be interesting, but not so dramatic as to require immediate surgical intervention. Then he settled into the waiting room chair and prepared for what he hoped would be the performance of his lifetime. An hour later, a young resident named Dr. Martinez called Charles's name and led him to a small examination, room equipped with all the medical paraphernalia that Charles had been secretly studying online for the past week. "So, Mr. Beaumont," Dr. Martinez said, consulting Charles's chart, "you're experiencing cardiac symptoms? Can you describe them for me?" Charles launched into a carefully rehearsed description of his condition, complete with dramatic pauses and subtle touches to his chest, that he hoped conveyed appropriate medical concern without veering into melodrama. "The palpitations are quite severe," he concluded, "and sometimes I feel faint, dizzy, like I might collapse at any moment." Dr. Martinez nodded thoughtfully, made several notes, and began the kind of basic examination that Charles had been preparing for, checking his blood pressure, listening to his heart, asking him to breathe deeply while pressing a stethoscope to various points on his chest. "Your vital signs appear normal," Dr. Martinez said after completing his examination. "Blood pressure is excellent. Heart rate is regular, lungs sound clear. Charles tried to look both relieved and concerned. But the symptoms could be caused by any number of factors, Dr. Martinez interrupted. Stress, caffeine, lack of sleep, anxiety. Have you been under any unusual pressure lately? Charles considered this question. He had been under the unusual pressure of being completely obsessed with a woman who probably thought he was insane, but that didn't seem like the kind of medical history one shared with emergency room doctors. Some business stress, he admitted. Nothing unusual. Dr. Martinez nodded and made more notes. I'm going to order an EKG and some blood work, just to rule out any underlying cardiac issues. But honestly, Mr. Beaumont, based on your examination, I suspect you're experiencing anxiety-related symptoms. This was not going according to plan. Charles had been hoping for something that would require extended observation, preferably in the cardiac unit where Dr. Hayes made her rounds. Anxiety-related symptoms sounded like the kind of diagnosis that resulted in being sent home with instructions to drink less coffee and get more sleep. Are you sure it's not something more serious? Charles asked, attempting to inject just the right amount of worry into his voice. The chest pain has been quite severe. You didn't mention chest pain before, Dr. Martinez observed, didn't I? Charles said quickly. Yes, definitely chest pain. Sharp, stabbing chest pain. Radiating down my left arm, actually. Dr. Martinez looked at him with the kind of expression that suggested he had heard this particular escalation of symptoms many times before. Mr. Beaumont, he said gently, are you sure you're experiencing chest pain? Because chest pain combined with the other symptoms you've described would indicate a much more serious condition. Charles realized he had reached a critical decision point. He could continue to escalate his fake symptoms, which might result in actual medical tests that could expose his deception. Or he could maintain his current level of theatrical illness and hope that someone would recommend extended observation. Before he could decide on a course of action, there was a knock on the examination room door, and Dr. Hayes walked in. Charles's carefully maintained expression of medical distress transformed into something much more genuine, complete and utter panic. Dr. Martinez, Dr. Hayes said, consulting a tablet. I understand you have a patient with cardiac symptoms who might need admission to our unit. Dr. Hayes, Dr. Martinez replied, this is Mr. Beaumont. He's experiencing palpitations, dizziness, and now reports chest pain. But his vital signs and examination are completely normal. Dr. Hayes looked at Charles for the first time, and her expression shifted from professional interest to something that looked remarkably like amused recognition. Mr. Beaumont, she said slowly, what a surprise to see you here. Charles attempted a weak smile. Dr. Hayes, what a coincidence. Indeed. Dr. Hayes moved closer, and Charles caught a whiff of her perfume. Something clean and subtle that made his actual heart rate spike in ways that definitely weren't medically advisable. And you're experiencing cardiac symptoms? Severe symptoms, Charles confirmed, though his voice came out as more of a squeak than the authoritative tone he had been aiming for. Dr. Hayes nodded thoughtfully. Dr. Martinez, would you mind if I took over Mr. Beaumont's case? I have some experience with unusual cardiac presentations, Charles. Wasn't entirely sure what she meant by unusual cardiac presentations. But the way she said it made him suspect that his deception was about to be thoroughly exposed. Dr. Martinez looked relieved to hand off what was clearly a complicated patient. Of course, Dr. Hayes. His EKG and blood work should be ready shortly. After Dr. Martinez left, Dr. Hayes turned to face Charles with an expression that was equal parts professional concern and barely suppressed laughter. Now then, Mr. Beaumont, she said, settling onto the rolling stool with the authority of someone who had clearly figured out exactly what was happening. Let's discuss these cardiac symptoms of yours. Charles opened his mouth to launch into his carefully prepared description of palpitations and chest pain, but Dr. Hayes held up one hand to stop him. Before you answer, she continued, I should mention that I've seen your complete medical history. You had a physical examination last month for your company's executive health program. Perfect cardiovascular health. No history of cardiac issues. Resting heart rate of 62, blood pressure of 120/78. Cholesterol levels that would make a cardiologist weep with joy. Charles felt his face growing hot. That's That's very thorough of you. I'm a very thorough person, Dr. Hayes replied, echoing his words from their previous conversation. So I'm going to ask you again. What are you really doing here, Mr. Beaumont? Charles looked at Dr. Hayes's expectant face, at the intelligence and humor dancing in her eyes, and realized that his elaborate deception had been doomed from the moment she walked into the examination room. I wanted to see you. Again, he said for the second time in 2 days. And faking a cardiac emergency seemed like a reasonable way to accomplish that. It seemed reasonable at the time, Charles admitted. In retrospect, it may have been slightly excessive. Dr. Hayes was quiet for several long moments, studying Charles with the kind of intense focus that made him feel like a particularly interesting medical specimen. Mr. Beaumont, she said finally, are you going to continue showing up at my hospital with increasingly elaborate medical emergencies until I agree to have dinner with you? Charles blinked. Would that work? Dr. Hayes laughed, the same genuine, delighted laugh that had made Charles fall even more hopelessly in love with her the day before. Probably not, she said. But I have to admit your commitment to this ridiculous pursuit is impressive. Misguided, definitely. Potentially illegal, possibly. But impressive. Charles felt hope blooming in his chest. Does that mean? What it means, Dr. Hayes interrupted, pulling out a prescription pad, is that I'm going to prescribe you a treatment that I think will be very effective for your condition. She scribbled something on the pad and handed it to him. Charles looked down at her handwriting, which was surprisingly neat for a doctor. The prescription read, 1 glass of water, 1 comfortable chair, and a serious conversation about normal social interaction. Repeat as needed until patient learns appropriate courtship behavior. Charles looked up from the prescription to find Dr. Hayes watching him with an expression that was part amusement, part exasperation, and part something else that made his pulse quicken. Your treatment plan, she explained, is to sit in that chair, drink some water, and explain to me why a successful businessman thinks the emergency room is an appropriate place for romantic pursuits. Charles settled into the chair Dr. Hayes had indicated, accepted the cup of water she offered him, and prepared to have the most important conversation of his life. But as he looked at her expectant face, at the way she was trying not to smile, at the obvious intelligence and humor that made her so much more attractive than any woman had a right to be, Charles realized that he might have just discovered something incredible. Dr. Emma Hayes was not only brilliant and beautiful and completely unimpressed by his wealth and status. She was also apparently immune to his ridiculous antics, which somehow made him want to continue performing them indefinitely. Could a man be both infuriating and oddly endearing? Charles was about to find out. After being officially diagnosed with what Dr. Hayes had termed acute romantic delusion syndrome and prescribed a chair and a glass of water, Charles Beaumont faced a crucial decision. He could accept defeat, apologize for his ridiculous behavior, and retreat to his normal life of board meetings and business deals, or he could double down on his hospital-based courtship strategy with even more elaborate and absurd tactics. Given that Charles had not achieved billionaire status by accepting defeat gracefully, the choice was obvious. The next phase of what Charles had begun thinking of as Operation Heart Monitor began at 6 a.m. the following Tuesday, when he appeared at the hospital's physical therapy department, claiming to suffer from a mysterious limp that required immediate professional evaluation. When did this limp begin? Asked Janet, the head physical therapist, as she watched Charles hobble dramatically across the exercise room. Yesterday, Charles replied, adding what he hoped was a convincing wince as he favored his left leg. I was stepping out of my car and something just gave way. This was technically true, though the something that had given way was his common sense rather than any part of his musculoskeletal system. Janet, who had been working in physical therapy for 23 years and had seen every possible variation of fake injury, watched Charles's performance with the patient skepticism of someone who dealt with insurance fraud on a weekly basis. Which leg is bothering you? She asked. The left one, Charles said confidently. But you're limping on your right leg. Charles glanced down at his feet as if surprised to discover their existence. Am I? Well, the pain is radiating. It's a very complex injury. I'm sure it is, Janet said dryly. Let's start with some basic mobility tests. For the next hour, Charles subjected himself to a series of physical therapy exercises that would have been challenging for someone with an actual injury and were absolutely torturous. For someone whose only physical ailment was an overwhelming desire to impress a cardiologist, he stretched muscles he hadn't used since college, balanced on equipment that seemed designed by someone with a grudge against the human spine, and performed coordination tests that made him question his basic motor skills. Your mobility seems perfectly normal, Janet observed as Charles completed what she had called a simple balance assessment, and what he had experienced as a form of medieval torture. Are you sure you're experiencing pain? Terrible pain, Charles confirmed, though he was no longer sure whether the pain was in his leg or simply everywhere else in his body. Maybe I should see a doctor? Someone from the cardiac unit? Just to rule out any circulation issues? Janet looked at him for several long moments, clearly trying to decide whether Charles was a legitimate patient or simply the most determined malingerer she had ever encountered. I think, she said finally, that what you need is some gentle exercise therapy. Come back tomorrow at the same time, and we'll work on your circulation. Charles agreed enthusiastically, even though he suspected that Janet's definition of gentle exercise therapy bore no resemblance to his own understanding of those words. His next brilliant strategy involved what he had convinced himself was a perfectly reasonable interest in hospital nutrition. Charles appeared at the cafeteria during the lunch rush, wearing a clipboard and what he hoped was an official-looking expression of culinary concern. Good afternoon, he announced to Maria, the cafeteria supervisor. Charles Beaumont, hospital nutrition consultant. I'm here to conduct a comprehensive evaluation of your food service operations. Maria, who had been running the hospital cafeteria since before Charles was born, and who possessed the kind of no-nonsense attitude that came from feeding hundreds of hungry medical professionals every day, looked at him with immediate suspicion. Nutrition consultant? She repeated. That's right, Charles confirmed, consulting his clipboard with what he hoped was professional authority. I specialize in cardiac healthy menu optimization. I'll need to taste test all of your offerings to ensure they meet appropriate dietary standards for heart patients. Maria folded her arms across her chest. And the hospital administration approved this consultation? Charles felt a familiar flutter of panic. He really needed to start coordinating his fake professional activities with actual hospital administrators. Well, he began, not exactly approved, per se, more like enthusiastically anticipated. Uh-huh. Maria picked up the phone. Let me just call. That won't be necessary. Dr. Hayes's voice interrupted from behind Charles, and he spun around to find her standing in the cafeteria entrance with a coffee cup in one hand and an expression of resigned amusement on her face. Mr. Beaumont is here in a personal capacity. Charles felt his fake clipboard suddenly weigh approximately 1,000 pounds. Dr. Hayes, he said, attempting to sound casual despite the fact that he was clearly caught in yet another elaborate deception. What a surprise to see you here. I eat lunch, Mr. Beaumont, she replied, moving to stand beside him with the kind of presence that made the entire cafeteria seem smaller. Most people do around this time of day, though I suspect you're here for reasons that have nothing to do with nutrition consultation. Charles glanced around the cafeteria, noting that their conversation was beginning to attract attention from the other diners. Several nurses were watching with obvious interest, and he was fairly certain he heard someone whisper, "That's the fake consultant guy," to their table mate. Perhaps we could discuss this somewhere more private? He suggested. Oh, I think this is perfect, Dr. Hayes replied, her voice carrying just loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. Please, Mr. Beaumont, tell everyone about your qualifications as a nutrition consultant. I'm sure they'd be fascinated. Charles realized he was trapped. He could either confess to yet another ridiculous deception in front of an audience of medical professionals, or he could attempt to maintain his cover story and risk even greater humiliation. He chose a third option. You know what? He said, raising his voice so that the entire cafeteria could hear him. I'm not a nutrition consultant. I'm not a hospital efficiency expert. I'm not a cardiac patient. I'm just a man who is completely, ridiculously, hopelessly in love with Dr. Emma Hayes, and I've been making up increasingly absurd excuses to spend time in this hospital. because I can't think of any other way to see her." The cafeteria fell completely silent. Even the background noise of clattering dishes and humming refrigerators seemed to pause in anticipation of Dr. Hayes' response. Dr. Hayes looked at Charles for several long moments, her expression unreadable. Then, to his complete amazement, she began to applaud, slowly at first, then with increasing enthusiasm. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced to the assembled crowd, "I give you Charles Beaumont, the most persistent, most creative, and most absolutely ridiculous suitor in medical history." The entire cafeteria erupted in applause and laughter. Someone shouted, "Go, Dr. Hayes!" from the back corner. Maria, the cafeteria supervisor, was grinning and shaking her head. Even the usually stern-faced security guard was chuckling. "Now then, Mr. Beaumont," Dr. Hayes continued, her voice still carrying clearly through the noise, "since you've made this very public declaration of your feelings, perhaps you'd like to join me for lunch. I promise the conversation will be much more interesting than nutrition consultation." Charles felt his heart perform what might have been a medically significant arrhythmia. You want to have lunch with me? I want to have lunch with the man who just admitted to an entire cafeteria full of medical professionals that he's been lying about cardiac symptoms and faking physical therapy injuries just to see me, Dr. Hayes corrected. That man sounds like he might be worth getting to know. As they settled at a corner table with their lunch trays, Charles couldn't help but notice that the entire cafeteria was still watching them with obvious fascination. Several nurses had their phones out, clearly documenting what they seemed to consider a significant romantic development. "So," Dr. Hayes said, unwrapping her sandwich with the kind of efficient precision she brought to everything else, "now that you've confessed to stalking me through various hospital departments, perhaps you'd like to explain what you were planning to do next, because I have to admit, your commitment to this ridiculous pursuit has been impressive." Charles took a sip of his coffee, buying time while he tried to formulate an answer that wouldn't make him sound even more insane than he already did. "I hadn't really thought that far ahead," he admitted. "I was sort of making it up as I went along, I noticed," Dr. Hayes replied dryly. "The fake limp was particularly creative. Though I should mention that Janet, from physical therapy, called me this morning to ask if I knew why a perfectly healthy man was pretending to have mobility issues." Charles felt his cheeks burning with embarrassment. "She figured it out?" "Charles, you limped on the wrong leg for half the session. Janet's seen actual injured people. She knows what real pain looks like." "Right," Charles said, making a mental note to research proper limping technique if he ever found himself in a similar situation. "So everyone knows?" "Everyone knows," Dr. Hayes confirmed. "The nurses have started a betting pool about what department you'll show up in next. Current favorite is pediatrics, though psychiatry is running a close second." Charles nearly choked on his coffee. "There's a betting pool? Oh yes, you've become quite the celebrity. The mystery man who keeps appearing with increasingly bizarre medical complaints, always asking for the cardiac unit, always looking disappointed when he gets actual medical care instead of me." Dr. Hayes took a bite of her sandwich, studying Charles with the kind of clinical interest that made him feel like a particularly fascinating case study. "The question is," she continued, "what happens now? Because I have to tell you, Mr. Beaumont, if you show up tomorrow claiming to need emergency appendix surgery, I'm going to have you committed for your own safety." Charles looked at Dr. Hayes across the cafeteria table, at the intelligence and humor in her eyes, at the way she managed to be simultaneously exasperated with and entertained by his ridiculous behavior. He realized that this moment, sitting in a hospital cafeteria, surrounded by curious medical professionals, having just made a complete fool of himself in front of dozens of strangers, was probably the happiest he had ever been. "What happens now," he said, "is that I stop pretending to have medical emergencies and start being honest about what I really want." "And what do you really want, Mr. Beaumont?" Charles looked around the cafeteria, at all the faces watching their conversation with obvious fascination, and decided that if he was going to be completely honest, he might as well do it properly. "I want to take you to dinner," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the room. "Somewhere that doesn't smell like antiseptic. Somewhere we can have a conversation that doesn't involve fake medical symptoms or pretend professional consultations. I want to find out if the woman who can see through all my ridiculous schemes is as extraordinary as I think she is." Dr. Hayes was quiet for several long moments, and Charles became acutely aware that the entire cafeteria was holding its breath, waiting for her response. "One dinner," she said finally. "One completely honest dinner where you promise not to pretend to be anyone other than Charles Beaumont, billionaire businessman, with apparently no understanding of appropriate social boundaries." "I promise," Charles said immediately. "No fake medical conditions, no made-up professional credentials, no elaborate deceptions of any kind. And if this dinner goes well," Dr. Hayes continued, "you'll stop showing up at my hospital with increasingly creative reasons why you need medical attention." "If this dinner goes well," Charles replied, "I won't need to show up at your hospital with fake medical emergencies. I'll have legitimate reasons to see you." Dr. Hayes smiled, the same genuine, delighted smile that had been making Charles's heart misbehave for the past week. "In that case, Mr. Beaumont," she said, "I think your prescription for romantic delusion syndrome might finally be working." As they finished their lunch, Charles couldn't help but notice that the betting pool seemed to have shifted focus from predicting his next fake medical emergency to speculating about the success of their upcoming date. He also noticed that Dr. Hayes seemed to be enjoying the attention almost as much as he was. When the whole hospital is rooting for him, how long can Emma resist? Based on the enthusiastic applause that erupted when Dr. Hayes agreed to dinner, Charles suspected the answer might be not much longer. But first, he had to survive an actual dinner conversation with the most intelligent, most perceptive, most absolutely terrifying woman he had ever met, without the safety net of fake medical conditions or pretend professional expertise. This was going to be either the best evening of his life or the most spectacular romantic failure in recorded history. The dinner reservation at Chez Laurent, the city's most exclusive French restaurant, had been surprisingly easy to secure once. Charles mentioned that he was dining with the doctor who saved my life. This was not entirely untrue, though Charles suspected that Dr. Hayes had saved him from himself, rather than from any actual medical condition. He arrived 30 minutes early, partly because punctuality was a cornerstone of successful business relationships, and partly because he needed time to practice not acting like a complete lunatic. Charles had spent the afternoon rehearsing normal conversation topics, researching Dr. Hayes's medical background, and reminding himself repeatedly that honesty was supposedly the foundation of all meaningful relationships. Dr. Hayes appeared in the restaurant entrance at exactly 7 o'clock, and Charles felt his carefully practiced composure evaporate instantly. She had traded her hospital scrubs for a simple black dress that somehow managed to be both elegant and understated, and her hair was loose around her shoulders in a way that made Charles forget every conversation topic he had prepared. "Good evening." "Mr. Beaumont," she said as the maitre d' led her to their table, "you look nervous." "I'm not nervous," Charles lied, standing to pull out her chair with the kind of elaborate courtesy he hoped would disguise the fact that his hands were trembling slightly. "I'm excited, anticipatory, enthusiastically expectant." Dr. Hayes settled into her seat with the graceful efficiency that characterized all her movements. "Charles, you're babbling." "I'm not babbling," Charles protested, though he realized she was absolutely correct. "I'm simply expressing my pleasure at this opportunity for meaningful interpersonal dialogue." Dr. Hayes looked at him with the kind of patient expression typically reserved for particularly anxious patients. "Are you going to talk like a corporate press release all evening, or are you planning to have an actual conversation at some point?" Charles took a deep breath, counted to 3, and attempted to engage his normal social functionality. "You're right. I'm sorry. I'm nervous because this is important to me, and I don't want to mess it up by saying something ridiculous." "Charles," Dr. Hayes said gently, "you spent the last week pretending to have cardiac emergencies and fake physical therapy needs just to see me. I think we've already established that you're willing to say ridiculous things." This was true, though Charles wasn't sure whether it was encouraging or deeply alarming. "The difference is," he said, "those were strategically ridiculous things, calculated to achieve a specific objective. This is just me trying to have a normal conversation with a woman I find incredibly fascinating. And how's that working out for you so far?" Charles considered this question while the sommelier presented their wine, selection with the kind of elaborate ceremony that seemed designed to intimidate people who weren't sure which fork to use for the salad course. Not particularly well, he admitted after they had ordered. I keep trying to impress you, and everything I say sounds either pretentious or insane. Dr. Hayes took a sip of her wine, studying Charles with the kind of clinical attention that made him feel like she was diagnosing something interesting. Charles, she said finally, can I ask you something? And I want you to answer honestly without trying to impress me or sound like a business proposal. Charles nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure he remembered how to communicate without some element of strategic positioning. Why me? She asked. You're wealthy, successful, presumably accustomed to dating women who are more traditionally receptive to grand romantic gestures. Why are you going to such elaborate lengths to pursue a hospital doctor who clearly thinks you're at least partially insane? The question hit Charles with unexpected force, partly because it was so direct, and partly because he wasn't sure he had a rational answer. Because, he said slowly, you're the first person I've met in years who sees straight through every game I play. You're brilliant, you're dedicated to work that actually matters, and you're completely unimpressed by anything that's ever impressed anyone else about me. Dr. Hayes raised an eyebrow. And that's attractive to you? Terrifying and attractive in equal measure, Charles admitted. Do you know what it's like to spend your entire adult life surrounded by people who agree with everything you say because you're wealthy enough to make their lives easier? Do you know how refreshing it is to meet someone who calls you ridiculous when you're being ridiculous? Dr. Hayes was quiet for several moments, and Charles worried that his honesty had been too intense, too revealing for a first date conversation. You know, she said finally, that's the first thing you've said all evening that sounds like it came from an actual human being rather than a public relations manual. Charles felt something loosen in his chest, as if he had been holding his breath for days without realizing it. I'm better at business conversations than personal ones. Business has rules, clear objectives, measurable outcomes. This, he gestured between them, this is completely uncharted territory. What kind of measurable outcomes are you hoping for from this dinner? Dr. Hayes asked, and Charles couldn't tell whether she was genuinely curious or testing him somehow. Honestly, I was hoping you'd find me slightly less ridiculous than you did yesterday. Maybe discover that there's a reasonably intelligent human being underneath all the fake medical emergencies and pretend hospital consultations. And if I do find you reasonably intelligent and slightly less ridiculous. Charles took a sip of his wine, buying time while he tried to formulate an answer that wouldn't sound like a corporate acquisition strategy. Then I was hoping you might be willing to see me again, under circumstances that don't involve me pretending to have mysterious medical conditions. Dr. Hayes smiled, not the amused, slightly exasperated smile he had grown accustomed to, but something warmer, more genuine. Charles, she said, can I tell you something about your hospital behavior that you might not have realized? Charles nodded, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear her assessment of his recent performance as a fake patient. The day you showed up in pediatrics, she continued, supposedly looking for the cardiac unit but somehow ending up in the children's ward instead. Charles felt his cheeks warming. He had been hoping she hadn't heard about that particular adventure. You spent 2 hours reading stories to sick kids, Dr. Hayes continued, not because it was part of your elaborate plan to see me, but because you walked into that ward and saw children who needed someone to pay attention to them. Charles shifted uncomfortably in his chair. That's not... I was looking for you, but those kids seemed... lonely, Dr. Hayes finished. They seemed lonely, and you couldn't walk away from that. Jenny, the little girl with leukemia? She's been asking about the story man all week. She wants to know when you're coming back to finish the tale about the dragon who was afraid of fire. Charles stared at Dr. Hayes, surprised by the sudden shift in her tone from clinical assessment to something that sounded almost... fond. I didn't think anyone noticed that, he said quietly. Charles, the pediatric nurses notice everything. They also notice that you spent your own money to buy books for the children's library, and that you arranged for the gift shop to stock better toys for the kids who are stuck here for extended stays. Charles felt his carefully constructed image of himself as a strategic romantic pursuer beginning to crumble. Those things weren't... they weren't part of any plan to impress you. "I know," Dr. Hayes said softly. "That's what made them impressive." The conversation that followed was unlike anything Charles had experienced in his adult life. Without the pressure of maintaining his ridiculous medical deceptions, without the need to impress Dr. Hayes with fake expertise or elaborate schemes, he found himself talking about things he had never discussed with anyone. His loneliness despite being surrounded by people, his growing sense that professional success was meaningless without personal connection, his fear that he had become so accustomed to strategic thinking that he had forgotten how to be genuinely spontaneous. Dr. Hayes, in turn, told him about her own challenges. The exhaustion of working in a profession where people's lives depended on her decisions, the difficulty of maintaining relationships when her work consumed most of her time and emotional energy, her frustration with men who were either intimidated by her intelligence or assumed that her medical degree made her less feminine. "So," Charles said as they finished their dessert, "what's your diagnosis, doctor? Am I a hopeless case of romantic dysfunction, or is there some chance of recovery?" Dr. Hayes considered this question with the same serious attention she brought to actual medical diagnoses. "I think," she said finally, "that you're suffering from a severe case of authenticity deficiency. You've spent so much time being strategically charming that you've forgotten how to just be yourself." "And what's the treatment for authenticity deficiency?" Dr. Hayes smiled, and Charles felt his heart perform its now familiar acrobatic routine. "More practice," she said. "More conversations like this one, where you're not trying to impress me with fake medical knowledge or elaborate deceptions. More situations where you have to rely on who you actually are, rather than who you think I want you to be." Charles felt hope blooming in his chest, though he tried to keep his expression appropriately restrained. "Does that mean you're willing to see me again?" "That means," Dr. Hayes replied, "that I'd like to see what happens when Charles Beaumont stops trying to be someone else and just tries to be himself." As they left the restaurant, Charles realized that Dr. Hayes had managed to accomplish something that no business adversary, no challenging negotiation, no corporate crisis had ever achieved. She had made him genuinely excited about the prospect of being completely, authentically himself. Was his foolishness actually his way of hiding sincerity? Based on the way Dr. Hayes was looking at him, with genuine interest instead of amused tolerance, Charles suspected the answer might be yes. But first, he had to figure out who he actually was underneath all the strategic charm and elaborate schemes, and something told him that Dr. Emma Hayes was going to make that journey both more challenging and more rewarding than anything he had ever attempted. Dr. Emma Hayes had been practicing medicine for 8 years, which meant she had developed a finely tuned ability to detect when patients were not being entirely truthful about their symptoms, their lifestyle choices, or their compliance with prescribed treatments. This skill had proven invaluable in her medical career, though she had never expected to apply it to her romantic life. Charles Beaumont, she had realized over the course of their dinner together, was suffering from a condition far more complex than simple romantic obsession. He was a man who had become so accustomed to strategic thinking that he appeared to have forgotten how to experience genuine emotions without immediately trying to weaponize them for maximum effect. This diagnosis had led Dr. Hayes to develop what she considered a particularly elegant treatment plan. The first phase of Charles's therapy began on Thursday morning, when he appeared at the hospital carrying an enormous bouquet of flowers and wearing the kind of nervous smile that suggested he was still not entirely sure whether their dinner had been a success or a disaster. "Good morning, Dr. Hayes," he said, approaching her at the nurse's station with the careful movements of someone who had finally learned that hospitals were professional workplaces rather than romantic stages. "I brought these for Mrs. Whitmore, but I was hoping I might be able to see you for a few minutes as well." Dr. Hayes looked up from the patient charts she was reviewing, noting that Charles appeared to be making a genuine effort to behave like a normal visitor, rather than a man with elaborate medical emergencies. "Good morning, Charles," she replied, and watched his face light up at her use of his first name. "Mrs. Whitmore will love the flowers. How are you feeling today? Any mysterious cardiac symptoms? Sudden onset of limping? Urgent need to consult about hospital nutrition policies?" Charles had the grace to look embarrassed. "No fake medical conditions today," he promised. "I'm here as a completely honest visitor with no hidden agendas or ulterior motives." How refreshing, Dr. Hayes said dryly. Though I have to admit, I'm almost disappointed. The nursing staff has been looking forward to your next creative medical emergency. There's a nursing staff? Charles looked around the cardiac unit with sudden concern. Are they watching me right now? Dr. Hayes glanced toward the break room, where she could see several nurses pretending to organize supplies while obviously eavesdropping on their conversation. Oh yes, she confirmed. You've become quite the celebrity. Betty started a spreadsheet tracking your various fake conditions. She's particularly impressed by your commitment to the mysterious limp. Charles appeared to be having some sort of internal struggle between embarrassment and what looked suspiciously like pride. A spreadsheet? He repeated. Color-coded by department and level of medical implausibility, Dr. Hayes continued. Your fake cardiac emergency scored particularly high marks for dramatic presentation, though points were deducted for obvious symptom fabrication. I see, Charles said slowly. And what was my overall score? Dr. Hayes consulted her tablet, though she was actually looking at Mrs. Whitmore's medication schedule. 7.4 out of 10. Strong marks for creativity and persistence, but significant penalties for medical inaccuracy and failure to research proper limping technique. Charles looked genuinely distressed by this assessment. Only 7.4? What would I need to do to score higher? Dr. Hayes stared at him for several long moments, trying to determine whether he was seriously asking for feedback on his fake medical emergency performance. Charles, she said carefully, are you asking me for tips on how to be more convincing the next time you pretend to have a mysterious illness? Well, Charles said, his voice taking on the slightly defensive tone of someone who was not entirely sure why his question was problematic. If I'm going to be evaluated on my performance, I'd like to understand the scoring criteria. Dr. Hayes realized that Charles had just provided her with the perfect opportunity to implement the second phase of his treatment plan. Actually, she said, I'm glad you mentioned performance evaluation, because I've been thinking about your condition, and I believe I've developed a comprehensive treatment protocol that should be very effective. Charles straightened immediately, his expression shifting to the kind of focused attention he typically reserved for important business negotiations. A treatment protocol? That's right, Dr. Hayes confirmed, pulling out her prescription pad with professional authority. You see, Charles, I've diagnosed you with a severe case of authenticity deficiency, complicated by strategic thinking syndrome. Left untreated, these conditions can lead to increasingly elaborate deceptions and a complete inability to form genuine emotional connections. Charles nodded seriously, as if Dr. Hayes were describing an actual medical condition rather than making elaborate fun of his recent behavior. And the treatment? He asked. Dr. Hayes began writing on her prescription pad, taking care to make her handwriting as illegibly medical as possible. The treatment, she said, involves a series of prescribed activities designed to force you to be completely, unavoidably genuine. No strategic thinking, no calculated charm, no elaborate schemes. Just Charles Beaumont, being himself in situations where authenticity is the only option. She tore off the prescription and handed it to him. Charles studied her handwriting with the intense concentration of someone trying to decode an ancient language. I can't read this, he admitted finally. It says, Dr. Hayes translated, patient must complete the following therapeutic activities. Daily broccoli foot baths to promote humility. Mandatory singing of lullabies to office plants to encourage emotional expression. An extended bed rest in the world's most uncomfortable. Chair to discourage future fake medical emergencies. Charles looked up from the prescription, with an expression that was equal parts confusion and growing alarm. Broccoli foot baths? He repeated. Very therapeutic, Dr. Hayes confirmed with complete medical authority. The combination of embarrassment and physical discomfort is excellent for treating strategic thinking syndrome. I'll need you to soak your feet in a basin of cool broccoli water for 20 minutes each morning, then report back to me with detailed descriptions of the experience. Charles appeared to be having some sort of internal struggle between his natural inclination to question, obviously, ridiculous medical advice and his desperate desire to do whatever Dr. Hayes asked of him, and the singing to office plants? Essential for emotional development, Dr. Hayes replied without missing a beat. Patients with authenticity deficiency often struggle to express genuine feeling. Singing lullabies to plants provides a safe, non-judgmental environment for practicing emotional expression. Charles nodded as if this made perfect sense, though his expression suggested he was beginning to suspect that Dr. Hayes might not be entirely serious about her medical recommendations. "How long would this treatment protocol continue?" he asked. "Until you demonstrate significant improvement in spontaneous authenticity," Dr. Hayes said. "I'll need to monitor your progress closely, of course. Daily check-ins, detailed symptom reports, photographic evidence of compliance with prescribed activities." Charles looked down at the prescription again, then back at Dr. Hayes's expectant face, and she could practically see him trying to determine whether she was implementing some sort of elaborate test of his commitment to their relationship. "Dr. Hayes," he said slowly, Are you making fun of me?" Dr. Hayes maintained her professional expression for several more seconds before allowing a smile to break through. "Charles," she said, "you spent the last week pretending to have cardiac emergencies and fake physical therapy needs just to talk to me. Did you really think I was going to prescribe you normal medical treatments?" Charles was quiet for several long moments, and Dr. Hayes found herself holding her breath, suddenly worried that her elaborate prank had gone too far. Then, to her complete amazement, Charles began to laugh. Not the polished, strategic chuckle she had heard him use in professional situations, but a genuine, delighted laugh that made several nurses poke their heads out of the break room to see what was happening. "Broccoli foot baths," he said between fits of laughter. "You want me to soak my feet in broccoli water and sing lullabies to plants." "Very therapeutic plants," Dr. Hayes corrected, though she was struggling to maintain her professional composure in the face of Charles's obvious amusement. "And you're going to monitor my compliance with photographic evidence?" "Daily photographic evidence," Dr. Hayes confirmed. "I take patient care very seriously." Charles looked at Dr. Hayes with an expression that was part admiration, part disbelief, and part something else that made her heart skip in a way that was definitely not medically advisable. "Dr. Emma Hayes," he said, "you are either the most brilliant woman I've ever met, or the most elaborate sadist in medical history. Can't I be both?" Dr. Hayes asked. Charles studied her face for several more moments, clearly trying to determine how serious she was about her ridiculous treatment protocol. "If I agree to this," he said finally, "the broccoli foot baths and the plant lullabies and the uncomfortable chair, will you have dinner with me again?" Dr. Hayes felt a flutter of something that might have been anticipation, or might have been impending disaster. "Charles," she said, "are you actually willing to soak your feet in broccoli water just to see me again?" "Dr. Hayes," Charles replied with the kind of absolute certainty that had made him a billionaire, "at this point, I would soak my entire body in broccoli water if that's what it took to convince you to give me another chance." Dr. Hayes looked at Charles's earnest face, at the obvious sincerity behind his ridiculous declaration, and realized that her elaborate treatment plan had just backfired spectacularly. Instead of discouraging his obsessive pursuit, she had apparently given him a structured program for demonstrating his devotion through increasingly absurd therapeutic activities. If Charles thought he was clever, he hadn't met Emma on the battlefield of pranks. But as she looked at his expectant expression, at the way he was clearly prepared to submit himself to any ridiculous treatment she prescribed, Dr. Hayes realized that she might have just discovered something wonderful. A man who was willing to be completely, authentically ridiculous just to make her smile. What man suffers broccoli baths for love? Only a desperate one. And Dr. Emma Hayes was beginning to suspect that Charles Beaumont's particular brand of desperation might be exactly what she had been looking for all along. Charles Beaumont had built his fortune on the principle that any challenge could be overcome through proper research, strategic planning, and absolute commitment to achieving the desired outcome. Dr. Hayes's prescription for broccoli foot baths and plant lullabies was simply the most unusual business challenge he had ever encountered, which was why, at 6 a.m. the following morning, Charles found himself standing in his marble bathroom, wearing designer pajamas, and staring at a basin filled with cool water and what appeared to be an entire head of broccoli that his personal chef had prepared according to very specific instructions. "This is for Emma," he reminded himself, as he rolled up his pajama pants and lowered his feet into the basin. This is a strategic investment in relationship development. The water was shockingly cold, and the sensation of broccoli florets bumping against his ankles was unlike anything Charles had ever experienced. He set his phone timer for 20 minutes and settled back in the chair he had positioned beside the basin, trying to convince himself that this was simply another form of executive wellness routine. By minute 3, Charles was questioning every decision that had led him to this moment. By minute 10, he was seriously considering whether his feelings for Dr. Hayes were worth subjecting himself to what could only be described as vegetable-based torture. By minute 15, he had achieved a sort of zen-like acceptance of his situation, and was actually beginning to find the experience oddly meditative. When the timer went off, Charles photographed his feet in the broccoli water from several angles, documenting his compliance with Dr. Hayes' prescribed treatment. Then he dried his feet, disposed of the broccoli water, and prepared for the second phase of his therapeutic regimen, singing lullabies to his office plants. Charles's downtown office occupied the entire top floor of a gleaming glass tower and featured floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the city. It also contained, he had recently discovered, 17 different plants that his interior designer had selected for their ability to thrive in artificial light and require minimal care. He had never paid much attention to these plants before, but Dr. Hayes' treatment protocol required him to sing lullabies to each one individually while documenting their response to his musical therapy. "Good morning," he said to the large ficus tree positioned near his desk, feeling remarkably foolish. I'm here to sing to you, for therapeutic purposes." The ficus tree did not respond, which Charles chose to interpret as enthusiastic consent. He cleared his throat and began singing "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star" in what he hoped was a soothing, lullaby-appropriate tone. The ficus tree continued not responding, though Charles thought he detected a slight rustling of leaves that might have indicated musical appreciation. By the time Charles had serenaded all 17 office plants, he had developed a surprisingly extensive lullaby repertoire and a growing sense that Dr. Hayes' treatment protocol was either brilliantly therapeutic or a form of elaborate psychological warfare. The third component of his treatment, extended bed rest in the world's most uncomfortable chair, required Charles to spend his lunch hour lying in a wooden chair that his office manager had procured from what appeared to be a medieval torture museum. "Mr. Beaumont," his assistant Jennifer said, as she found him contorted in the chair with his eyes closed and his legs dangling at what looked like physically impossible angles. Are you all right?" "I'm fine," Charles replied without opening his eyes. "I'm undergoing therapeutic bed rest as prescribed by my physician." Jennifer looked at the wooden chair, at Charles's obviously uncomfortable position, and at the stack of plant photographs on his desk. "Sir," she said carefully, "should I be concerned about your mental health?" Charles opened one eye to look at his assistant, who had worked for him for 3 years and had never questioned his judgment about anything more significant than lunch preferences. "Jennifer," he said, "have you ever been in love?" "Yes, sir," Jennifer replied, though her tone suggested she was not sure why he was asking. "And did being in love make you do things that seemed completely irrational to outside observers?" Jennifer considered this question while studying Charles's position in the uncomfortable chair. "Well," she said finally, "when I was dating my husband, I did spend an entire weekend learning to make sushi because he mentioned liking Japanese food, even though I'm allergic to seafood and the smell of fish makes me nauseous." "Exactly," Charles said with satisfaction. "Love makes us do ridiculous things. I'm just doing them more, systematically." Jennifer nodded as if this explanation made perfect sense, though Charles suspected she was simply being polite. "Should I hold your calls while you're therapeutically resting?" she asked. "Yes, please." "And Jennifer? If anyone asks why I'm lying in an uncomfortable chair, singing to plants, and documenting my feet in broccoli water, you can tell them it's part of an innovative executive wellness program." "Of course, Mr. Beaumont," Jennifer replied, though Charles caught her muttering something about executive wellness as she left his office. For the next week, Charles subjected himself to Dr. Hayes's elaborate treatment protocol with the same dedication he brought to hostile corporate takeovers. He soaked his feet in progressively creative broccoli preparations, expanded his plant lullaby repertoire to include everything from classical music to contemporary pop songs, and spent increasingly lengthy periods contorted in chairs that seemed designed by someone with a personal grudge against human comfort. He documented everything with photographic evidence that he sent to Dr. Hayes each evening, accompanied by detailed reports on his therapeutic progress. Dr. Hayes, to her credit, responded to each submission with professional seriousness, offering medical-sounding feedback on his broccoli-soaking technique and suggestions for improving his emotional connection to the office plants. "Your Day 3 broccoli foot bath shows significant improvement in vegetable-to-foot ratio," she texted, after reviewing his latest batch of photographs. "However, I'm concerned that your lullaby performance for the Peace Lily lacks genuine emotional investment. Consider exploring more personally meaningful musical selections." Charles responded by learning to sing "The Way You Look Tonight" to his office plants, which resulted in what he was certain was increased leaf rustling, and possibly even some new growth on the philodendron near his conference table. But it was on day 7 of his treatment protocol that Charles achieved his breakthrough moment. He was midway through singing "Moon River" to a particularly unresponsive snake plant when Jennifer knocked on his office door with an expression of barely contained panic. "Mr. Beaumont," she said, "I'm sorry to interrupt your plant therapy session, but there's a situation that requires your immediate attention." Charles looked up from the snake plant, still humming under his breath. "What kind of situation?" "There's a woman here to see you. She says she's your doctor, and she needs to conduct a surprise inspection of your compliance with prescribed medical treatments." Charles felt his heart perform what was becoming its signature acrobatic routine. "Dr. Hayes is here?" "She's in the reception area," Jennifer confirmed. "She has a clipboard and what appears to be some sort of medical evaluation form. She looks very unofficial." Charles glanced around his office, taking in the photographic evidence of broccoli foot baths scattered across his desk, the carefully documented plant lullaby schedule posted on his wall, and the medieval torture chair positioned prominently near his window. "Send her in," he said, straightening his tie and trying to look like a man who definitely had not just been singing romantic ballads to office vegetation. Dr. Hayes entered his office wearing a white coat over her street clothes and carrying a clipboard with the kind of professional authority that made Charles suddenly nervous about his treatment compliance. She looked around the office with clinical interest, noting the plant photographs, the uncomfortable chair, and what appeared to be a small basin of broccoli water hidden behind his desk. "Good afternoon, Mr. Beaumont," she said, consulting her clipboard with official seriousness. "I'm here to conduct a surprise evaluation of your adherence to prescribed therapeutic activities." Charles stood behind his desk, trying to project executive confidence despite the fact that he was fairly certain he still had plant fertilizer on his hands from his morning lullaby session. "Dr. Hayes," he said, What a surprise to see you here. Surprise evaluations are an essential component of effective medical treatment," Dr. Hayes replied, making a note on her clipboard. "I trust you've been complying with all aspects of your prescribed therapy?" Charles glanced at the evidence of his ridiculous morning routine scattered throughout his office. "Yes, absolutely. Full compliance with all therapeutic recommendations." "Excellent," Dr. Hayes said, moving closer to examine the photographs on his desk. "I see you've been documenting your broccoli foot bath sessions. How has that been affecting your strategic thinking syndrome?" Charles considered this question seriously. "Well, it's definitely been humbling. Hard to feel overly strategic when you're soaking your feet in cold vegetables at 6 in the morning." Dr. Hayes nodded approvingly and made another note. "And the plant lullaby therapy? How have your office plants been responding to your musical interventions?" Charles looked around at his 17 office plants, several of which actually did seem to be looking healthier since he had begun his daily serenading routine. "I think they're enjoying it," he said honestly. "The ficus near my desk has definitely gotten greener, and the peace lily seems to perk up whenever I sing Sinatra." "Interesting," Dr. Hayes murmured, approaching the snake plant that Charles had been singing to when she arrived. "And this one? How does it respond to your lullabies?" Charles felt his cheeks warming. That one's been challenging, very unresponsive. I was just trying Moon River when you arrived, but I'm not sure it's having any therapeutic effect. Dr. Hayes studied the snake plant with the kind of clinical attention she typically reserved for cardiac patients. Perhaps the problem is your song selection. Snake plants are notoriously difficult to reach emotionally. They require more personal musical expression. More personal? Dr. Hayes turned to face Charles with an expression that was part medical, professional and part something else that made his pulse quicken. Sing to it the way you would sing to someone you care about, she said softly, not as a therapeutic exercise, but as a genuine expression of feeling. Charles looked at Dr. Hayes, at the intelligence and humor in her eyes, at the way she was managing to be simultaneously ridiculous and absolutely enchanting. You want me to sing to the plant like I would sing to you? He asked. I want you to sing to the plant like you would sing to anyone who mattered to you, Dr. Hayes corrected, though her voice carried a slight tremor that suggested the distinction might not be as clear-cut as she pretended. Charles turned to face the snake plant, took a deep breath, and began singing The Way You Look Tonight with the kind of genuine emotion he had never allowed himself to express in any professional context. But as he sang, he found himself looking not at the plant, but at Dr. Hayes, who was watching him with an expression that had nothing to do with medical evaluation, and everything to do with a woman falling in love, despite her better judgment. When he finished the song, the office fell completely silent except for the sound of the air conditioning and what might have been the snake plant rustling its leaves in appreciation. That was, Dr. Hayes began, then stopped, apparently having difficulty finding appropriate medical terminology for what she had just witnessed. Therapeutically effective? Charles suggested, though his voice came out rougher than he intended. That was beautiful, Dr. Hayes said simply, and Charles felt something fundamental shift in the space between them. They stood facing each other across his office, surrounded by the evidence of Charles's week-long submission to the most ridiculous medical protocol in history. And Charles realized that Dr. Hayes's elaborate treatment plan had worked exactly as intended. Not because the broccoli foot baths and plant lullabies had cured his strategic thinking syndrome, but because they had forced him to be genuinely, authentically, completely himself in front of the woman he was falling in love with. Dr. Hayes, he said quietly, can I ask you something? Yes? This whole elaborate treatment protocol, the broccoli baths, the plant lullabies, the uncomfortable chairs, was this your way of testing whether I was serious about changing? Whether I was willing to be ridiculous for you instead of just being ridiculous to impress you? Dr. Hayes was quiet for several long moments, studying Charles with the kind of clinical attention that made him feel like she was diagnosing something important. Charles, she said finally, when I prescribed those treatments, I was trying to prove to myself that you were just another wealthy man who would give up as soon as the pursuit required genuine effort instead of elaborate gestures. And now? Dr. Hayes moved closer, close enough that Charles could smell her perfume, close enough to see the way her carefully professional composure was beginning to crack. Now, she said softly, I'm beginning to suspect that any man who would spend a week singing lullabies to office plants just to make me smile might actually be worth getting to know. Charles felt his heart perform what was definitely not a medically advisable maneuver. Does that mean my treatment is working? It means, Dr. Hayes replied, reaching out to straighten his tie with gentle fingers, that we might need to revise your therapeutic protocol. Less broccoli, more personal interaction. Charles looked down at Dr. Hayes's hands on his tie, at the way she was standing close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her body, and realized that his week of elaborate medical compliance had been worth every ridiculous moment. Dr. Hayes, he said, would personal interaction include the possibility of another dinner? Somewhere that doesn't require me to document my feet in vegetable water afterward? Dr. Hayes smiled, the same genuine, delighted smile that had been making Charles's cardiovascular system misbehave for weeks. I think, she said, that might be exactly what the doctor ordered. What man suffers broccoli baths for love? Only a desperate one. And as Dr. Hayes's fingers lingered on his tie, as her professional facade finally gave way to something warmer and more personal, Charles Beaumont realized that his particular brand of desperation had just achieved the impossible. It had made the most brilliant, most beautiful, most absolutely perfect woman in the world fall in love with him. But first, he had to survive the transition from fake patient to actual boyfriend, and something told him that Dr. Emma Hayes was going to make that journey both more challenging and more rewarding than any business deal he had ever negotiated. The second dinner happened 3 days later, at a small Italian restaurant that Dr. Hayes had chosen specifically, because it was the kind of place where people went to have serious conversations rather than to see and be seen. Charles arrived early again, though this time his punctuality was motivated by genuine nervousness rather than the need to practice. Not acting like a lunatic, he had spent the morning completing what he had decided would be his final broccoli foot bath, singing a farewell lullaby to his office plants, and mentally preparing for what he suspected would be the most important conversation of his adult life. Dr. Hayes appeared at exactly 7:30, looking relaxed and beautiful in a way that made Charles forget every carefully prepared topic of conversation. She had traded her medical coat for a soft blue sweater that brought out her eyes, and her hair was loose around her shoulders in the style that made Charles's brain stop functioning properly. "Good evening, Charles," she said, settling into her chair with the graceful efficiency that characterized all her movements. "How are you feeling? Any residual effects from your broccoli therapy?" "Clean feet and a deeper appreciation for plant life," Charles replied, surprised by how naturally the humor came. "Though I have to admit, I'm going to miss my morning lullaby sessions." The ficus seemed genuinely disappointed this morning when I explained that I was transitioning to a new treatment protocol. Dr. Hayes laughed, the genuine, delighted laugh that Charles was beginning to think of as his favorite sound in the world. "I'm sure the plants will adjust," she said, "though you might want to consider reducing their emotional dependence gradually. Cold turkey musical withdrawal can be traumatic for office vegetation." Charles found himself relaxing despite the importance of the evening. This was what he had discovered during his week of ridiculous compliance with Dr. Hayes' treatment protocol. Being authentically himself, even when that self was engaged in absurd activities, was infinitely more comfortable than trying to strategically impress someone. "Emma," he said, using her first name deliberately, and noting the way her expression softened when he did. "Can I ask you something that's been bothering me?" "Of course." Charles took a sip of wine, buying himself time while he tried to formulate a question that had been nagging at him since their first dinner. "Why did you agree to see me again?" he asked finally. "I mean, really, not the official medical explanation about treatment protocols and therapeutic compliance. The real reason." Emma was quiet for several moments, and Charles found himself holding his breath while she considered her answer. "Because," she said slowly, "you're the first man I've met who was willing to make a complete fool of himself just to spend time with me. Not to impress me with how successful you are, or how much money you have, or how many important people you know. Just to be near me." Charles felt something warm and dangerous unfurling in his chest. "That's because being near you is more important to me than looking sophisticated or maintaining my professional dignity." "Charles," Emma said gently, "do you understand how rare that is? Do you know how many men I've dated who were more interested in the idea of dating a doctor than they were in actually getting to know me?" Charles considered this while the waiter refilled their wine glasses and presented them with menus that Charles barely glanced at. "I can't imagine anyone not wanting to know you," he said honestly. "You're the most interesting person I've ever met." "You say that now," Emma replied with a slight smile. "But you haven't heard about my complete inability to keep houseplants alive, my addiction to terrible reality television, or my tendency to diagnose fictional characters with unlikely medical conditions while watching movies." Charles felt his heart perform another unauthorized gymnastics routine. "Emma, those things don't make you less interesting. They make you more human." Emma looked at him, across the restaurant table with an expression that was part surprise and part something else that made Charles feel like he had just won the lottery. "You know," she said, "I was planning to spend this dinner testing whether you could maintain normal human behavior without the safety net of elaborate medical deceptions. And how am I doing so far?" "Surprisingly well," Emma admitted. "Though I have to ask, what happens now? I mean, assuming this dinner goes well and we continue seeing each other, what's your long-term plan?" Because I have to tell you, Charles, I don't date casually. I don't have time for games or uncertainty or men who aren't sure what they want. Charles set down his wine glass and looked directly into Emma's eyes, feeling the weight of the moment settling around them like gravity. "Emma," he said, "I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I don't want to date you casually. I don't want to play games. I want to build something real with you. Something that matters more than business deals or social status or any of the other things I thought were important before I met you." Emma was quiet for several long moments, and Charles found himself studying her face, trying to read the thoughts behind her intelligent eyes. "Charles," she said finally, "can I tell you something that might scare you away?" Charles felt his pulse quicken, though he wasn't sure whether it was from anticipation or anxiety. "Yes." "I don't just want someone who thinks I'm interesting," she said, her voice taking on the kind of careful intensity that Charles had learned to associate with her most serious moments. "I want someone who understands that my work will always be important to me. Someone who can handle the fact that I sometimes work 16-hour days, that I get called away for medical emergencies, that there will be times when sick patients take priority over dinner reservations or social obligations." Charles nodded, though he suspected Emma wasn't finished. "I want someone who can be proud of my career instead of threatened by it," she continued. "Someone who doesn't need me to be less than I am in order to feel more important himself. And I want someone who's looking for a real partnership, not just a romantic accessory to make him look more interesting at business dinners." Charles felt something fundamental click into place in his chest, like a key turning in a lock he hadn't realized was there. "Emma," he said quietly, "everything you just described, your dedication to your work, your intelligence, your complete inability to be anything less than extraordinary, those aren't obstacles to overcome. They're the reasons I fell in love with you." The words were out before Charles could stop them, hanging in the restaurant air like a confession he hadn't meant to make quite so soon. Emma stared at him across the table, her expression shifting from surprise to something deeper and more complex. "You, what?" she said. Charles realized he had reached another crucial decision point. He could backtrack, claim he had misspoken, try to retreat to safer conversational territory, or he could lean into the honesty that had gotten him this far. "I'm in love with you," he repeated, his voice gaining strength as he committed to the truth. "Completely, hopelessly, ridiculously in love with you. Not with the idea of you, not with your impressive medical degree or your professional success, but with you. With your intelligence and your compassion and your ability to see straight through every ridiculous thing I've done to try to impress you." Emma continued to stare at him, and Charles began to worry that his declaration had been too much, too soon, too intense for a second date conversation. "Charles," she said slowly, "do you understand what you're saying? Because love isn't the same thing as obsession or infatuation or the thrill of pursuing someone who's been resistant to your charm." "I know," Charles said firmly. "I've spent my entire adult life confusing strategic attraction with genuine feeling. But Emma, what I feel for you is nothing like anything I've ever experienced. It's not about the chase or the challenge or the satisfaction of winning someone over. It's about the way my entire world makes more sense when you're in it." Emma was quiet for so long that Charles began to wonder if he had just destroyed everything they were building together. "Charles," she said finally, "I need you to understand something. If we're going to do this, if we're going to try to build something real together, there can't be any more elaborate schemes or strategic manipulation or attempts to manage the situation. Just honesty, even when it's uncomfortable." Charles nodded, though his heart was beating so fast he was beginning to wonder if he needed actual medical attention. "Can you handle that?" Emma asked. "Can you handle being in a relationship where you don't get to control the outcome? Where you have to trust that being yourself is enough?" Charles looked at Emma's serious face, at the way she was watching him with complete attention, and realized that she was offering him something he had never thought he wanted. The chance to be loved for who he actually was, rather than who he thought he should be. "Emma," he said, "I spent a week singing lullabies to office plants because you asked me to. I think I can handle being authentically myself." Emma smiled then, not the amused, slightly exasperated smile he had grown accustomed to, but something warm and genuine, and full of possibility. In that case, she said, reaching across the table to take his hand, I should probably tell you that I'm falling in love with you too. Charles felt his heart stop, restart, and then begin beating in what felt like an entirely new rhythm. You are? He managed. I am, Emma confirmed, her fingers intertwining with his in a gesture that felt both simple and monumentally significant. With the man who pretended to have cardiac emergencies just to see me, who subjected himself to broccoli foot baths without complaint, and who just told me he loves my career instead of seeing it as competition for my attention. Charles looked down at their joined hands, at the way Emma's fingers fit perfectly between his own, and felt something settle in his chest that he had never experienced before. Complete, perfect contentment. So, he said, what happens now? Emma squeezed his hand gently. Now we find out whether the man who conquered my hospital can handle the much more challenging task of building a real relationship with the woman who loves him back. Charles lifted their joined hands to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to Emma's knuckles in a gesture that felt both reverent and full of promise. Dr. Emma Hayes, he said softly, I can't wait to find out. Would she dare let her walls fall for the most ridiculous patient she'd ever had? Based on the way Emma was looking at him, with complete openness instead of clinical assessment, Charles suspected the answer was yes. But first, they had to navigate the transition from elaborate hospital courtship to actual relationship. And something told him that loving Emma Hayes was going to require every bit of authenticity, vulnerability, and genuine emotion he had been learning to access over the past few weeks. It was going to be the greatest challenge of his life. And for the first time in his adult existence, Charles Beaumont was looking forward to a challenge he couldn't solve with money, strategy, or elaborate schemes, only with the kind of honest, imperfect, completely genuine love he had never believed he was capable of giving. Six months later, Charles Beaumont stood in the cardiac unit of Providence General Hospital, wearing a perfectly normal visitor's badge and carrying a bouquet of flowers that he had purchased for entirely legitimate, non-manipulative reasons. He was there to pick up Mrs. Whitmore, who was finally being discharged after a longer-than-expected recovery that had involved several setbacks, 2 additional procedures, and what the medical staff diplomatically referred to as complications related to patient non-compliance with rest recommendations. Mrs. Whitmore, it turned out, was as stubborn about following medical orders as Charles was about pursuing impossible goals. Mr. Beaumont, she greeted him as he entered her room, her voice carrying the same mixture of fondness and exasperation that had characterized their working relationship for 15 years. You look different. Charles settled into the visitor's chair that had become as familiar as his office furniture over the past months. Different how? Happy, Mrs. Whitmore said simply. Genuinely happy, not just professionally satisfied. It suits you. Charles felt a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, the kind of spontaneous expression that had become increasingly common since Emma had entered his life. I have something to tell you, he said, reaching into his jacket pocket. Actually, several things to tell you. Mrs. Whitmore raised an eyebrow, clearly recognizing the tone Charles typically used for important business announcements. First, Charles continued, I want to thank you for having a heart attack. Mrs. Whitmore blinked. I'm sorry, what? I mean, Charles said quickly. I'm obviously grateful that you recovered completely and that your cardiac function has returned to normal parameters. But if you hadn't been hospitalized, I never would have met Emma, and I never would have discovered that I'm capable of falling in love with someone who sees straight through all my ridiculous schemes. Mrs. Whitmore's expression shifted from confusion to delighted understanding. And how is Dr. Hayes? Still tolerating your elaborate romantic gestures? Actually, Charles said, she's trained me to express my feelings through normal human behavior, rather than fake medical emergencies and elaborate hospital consulting schemes. Though I did sing happy birthday to all my office plants last week when the ficus turned 1 year old. Mrs. Whitmore laughed, the same genuine, delighted laugh that Charles had learned ran in families, since Emma made exactly the same sound when he said something particularly ridiculous. She's reformed you, Mrs. Whitmore observed. She's improved me, Charles corrected. Made me into someone who can have authentic relationships instead of strategic alliances. Someone who can be loved for who he actually is, rather than who he thinks people want him to be. Mrs. Whitmore nodded approvingly. And what was the second thing you wanted to tell me? Charles took a deep breath, suddenly feeling as nervous as he had during his first fake cardiac emergency. I'm going to ask Emma to marry me, he said. Mrs. Whitmore's face lit up with the kind of joy that made Charles understand why Emma had chosen a profession dedicated to making people feel better. Charles, she said, that's wonderful. When? Tonight, Charles admitted. After dinner. I've been carrying the ring around for 2 weeks, waiting for the perfect moment. But Emma told me yesterday that she prefers authenticity to perfection. So I figured I should stop trying to orchestrate the ideal romantic scenario and just ask her when it feels right. Mrs. Whitmore studied Charles with the sharp assessment that had made her indispensable to his business operations. And you're nervous. Terrified, Charles confirmed. Not because I'm not sure she'll say yes. Well, actually, I am a little worried about that. But because this is the most important thing I've ever done. And I can't control the outcome through strategic planning or elaborate gestures. Charles, Mrs. Whitmore said gently, do you remember what you told me about Dr. Hayes when you first met her? You said she was the first person who could see straight through your professional charm to who you really were underneath. Charles nodded. Well, Mrs. Whitmore continued, that woman has spent the last 6 months getting to know the real Charles Beaumont. Not the billionaire businessman. Not the man with elaborate romantic schemes, but the person who sings lullabies to office plants and submits to broccoli foot baths because someone he loves asked him to. If she's going to say yes to anyone, it's going to be to him. Charles felt some of the tension in his chest ease. You think so? I know so, Mrs. Whitmore said firmly. But there's something I want to tell you before you go propose to the woman who saved both our lives. Charles looked at his secretary. His friend, really, though it had taken him years to understand the difference, and waited for whatever wisdom she was about to impart. You've become a better man since meeting Dr. Hayes, she said. Not just happier, but kinder. More genuine, more willing to be vulnerable. And Charles, that's not because she changed you. That's because she gave you permission to be the person you always had the potential to be. Charles felt his throat tighten with unexpected emotion. Mrs. Whitmore, don't get sentimental on me now, she interrupted, though her eyes were bright with unshed tears. Save the emotional speeches for your proposal. Just be yourself. Be the man who was willing to make a fool of himself in hospital cafeterias and sing to office plants. Be the man who learned that authenticity is more attractive than strategy. Be the Charles Beaumont that Dr. Hayes fell in love with. Charles stood and moved around the bed to hug Mrs. Whitmore, something he had never done in 15 years of working together, but which felt completely natural now. Thank you, he said simply, for everything, for having excellent taste in cardiologists, for encouraging my ridiculous pursuit strategies, and for teaching me that some things are worth more than business success. Just promise me one thing, Mrs. Whitmore said as Charles prepared to leave. Anything. Promise me you won't try to propose during some elaborate fake medical emergency. Dr. Hayes has been through enough. Hospital drama for one relationship. Charles laughed, the genuine, unstrategic laugh that Emma had taught him how to use. I promise, he said. No fake medical conditions. No hospital consulting schemes. No elaborate deceptions of any kind. Just me, asking the woman I love to spend the rest of her life putting up with my reformed but still occasionally ridiculous behavior. 8 hours later, Charles found himself standing in Emma's apartment, which was filled with the kind of comfortable clutter that spoke of someone who had more important things to worry about than interior design. Medical journals were stacked on every available surface, houseplants of questionable health drooped from various windowsills, and the television was tuned to what appeared to be a reality show about people renovating houses in tropical locations. Emma, he said, interrupting her commentary about the structural integrity of a beach house renovation. Can I ask you something? Emma turned from the television with the kind of attention she had learned to give him when he used his serious voice. Not the strategic, serious voice he employed for business negotiations, but the authentically concerned tone he had developed for discussing things that actually mattered. "Of course," she said, settling beside him on the couch, with the graceful efficiency that characterized all her movements. Charles looked at Emma's expectant face, at the intelligence and humor in her eyes, at the way she was completely present, in the moment instead of distracted by work calls or social obligations or any of the other things that had made his previous relationships feel like extended business. "Meetings, Emma," he began, then stopped, realizing that all his carefully prepared speeches had evaporated under the pressure of the moment. "Charles," Emma said gently, "whatever you want to ask me, just ask. We've established that authenticity works better than strategic planning." Charles took a deep breath, reached into his pocket, and pulled out the ring box he had been carrying around for 2 weeks. "Emma Hayes," he said, his voice steadier than he had expected, "will you marry me?" Emma stared at the ring box for several long moments, and Charles found himself holding his breath while she processed his question. "Charles," she said slowly, "are you asking me to marry you because you think it's the next logical step in our relationship, or because you can't imagine spending the rest of your life with anyone else?" Charles felt his heart perform what had become its signature acrobatic routine whenever Emma asked him a question that required complete honesty. "I'm asking you to marry me," he said, "because you've made me into someone I actually like being. Because you've taught me that authenticity is more valuable than success, that vulnerability is more attractive than control, and that being loved for who you really are is worth any amount of ridiculous behavior." Emma was quiet for several more moments, and Charles began to worry that his answer hadn't been romantic enough, or specific enough, or whatever it was that women expected from marriage proposals. "And," he continued, "because I love you more than I've ever loved anything in my life, and I want to spend the next 60 years learning how to love you better." Emma's face broke into the radiant smile that had been making Charles's cardiovascular system misbehave for months. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you, but only if you promise me something." Charles felt relief flooding through his system like medicine. "Anything. Promise me that if I ever end up in the hospital again, you won't try to get yourself admitted as a patient just to stay close to me." Charles laughed, sliding the ring onto Emma's finger with hands that trembled only slightly. "I promise, though I might volunteer to sing lullabies to the pediatric patients." Emma looked down at her ring, then back at Charles with an expression that was part love, part amusement, and part something else that made him feel like the luckiest man in medical history. "You know," she said, "when I first met you, I thought you were either the most elaborate hypochondriac or the most determined stalker in hospital history. And now?" Emma reached up to touch Charles's face with the gentle reverence that had become his favorite sensation in the world. "Now I know you're just the most wonderfully ridiculous man who ever fell in love with a doctor." Charles pulled Emma closer, marveling at the way she fit perfectly against his chest, at the way her presence made everything else in his life make sense. "Dr. Emma Hayes Beaumont," he said, testing out the sound of her married name. "Has a nice ring to it," Emma agreed. "Though you realize that marrying me means accepting a lifetime of medical emergencies, hospital schedules, and the occasional need to prioritize patient care over romantic dinners." Charles looked down at Emma's face, at the intelligence and compassion and absolute honesty that had made him fall in love with her in the first place. "Emma," he said, "I spent months pretending to have fake medical emergencies just to see you. I think I can handle a few real ones." Emma laughed, the genuine, delighted laugh that Charles had learned was his favorite sound in the universe, and settled more comfortably against his chest. "In that case," she said, "I think we're going to have a very interesting marriage." As they sat together on Emma's couch, surrounded by medical journals and drooping houseplants and the comfortable clutter of a life dedicated to healing others, Charles Beaumont realized that he had finally achieved something he hadn't even known he was looking for. He had found someone who loved him not despite his ridiculous behavior, but because of the authenticity and vulnerability that his ridiculous behavior had revealed. 6 months earlier, he had been a successful businessman with no understanding of genuine human connection. Tonight, He was an engaged man who had learned that the most important victories couldn't be won through strategy or manipulation or elaborate schemes, only through the kind of honest, imperfect, completely genuine love that he had never believed he was capable of giving. Mrs. Whitmore had been right, as usual. Emma hadn't changed him. She had simply given him permission to become the person he had always had the potential to be. For Charles Beaumont, the only prescription that ever worked was Emma Hayes. And as they began planning a future together, surrounded by the evidence of Emma's dedication to healing and Charles's reformed but still occasionally ridiculous approach to romance, they both knew that their love story had evolved from hospital hijinks into something much more precious. A partnership built on authenticity, vulnerability, and the kind of mutual devotion that could survive anything, even Charles's tendency to turn normal situations into elaborate romantic productions. Their wedding, 6 months later, would take place in the hospital chapel, officiated by the chief of cardiology and attended by every nurse, doctor, and staff member who had witnessed Charles's transformation from fake patient to genuine partner. Mrs. Whitmore would serve as maid of honor. The pediatric patients would provide musical entertainment, and Charles would promise to love, honor, and never again pretend to have mysterious cardiac symptoms just to see his bride. But that night, as Emma fell asleep in Charles's arms while a reality show played quietly in the background, the most important promise had already been made. Two people who had found authentic love in the most ridiculous circumstances had committed to building a life together based on honesty, vulnerability, and the kind of devotion that transforms ordinary moments into something extraordinary. For Charles Beaumont, the only prescription that ever worked was Emma Hayes.